Princess Louise Maximilienne Caroline Emmanuele of Stolberg-Gedern was the wife of the Jacobite claimant to the English and Scottish thrones, Charles Edward Stuart. She is commonly called Countess of Albany. Birth and early life. Louise was born in Mons, Hainaut, in the Austrian Netherlands, the eldest daughter of Prince Gustav Adolf of Stolberg-Gedern and of his wife Princess Elizabeth of Horns, the daughter of Maximilienne, Prince of Horns. When she was only 4 years old, her father was killed at the Battle of Leuthen. When she was 7, she was sent to be educated at the school attached to the convent of St. Wardreau in Mons. The mission of this convent was to provide a home for young ladies of the nobility who had insufficient financial means to live unmarried in the world. In 1766, the Empress Maria Theresa arranged for the convent to give to Louise one of its endowed prebends. Although technically Louise was a canoness, she was not required to stay in the convent cloister and was still allowed to travel in society. Indeed, for most of the canonesses, the acceptance of a prebend was merely a temporary stage until they found appropriate noble husbands. Marriage. In 1771, Louise's younger sister married the Marquis of Jamaica, only son of the 3rd Duke of Berwick. The Duke of Berwick's uncle, the Duc de Fitzjames, began negotiations with Louise's mother for remarriage between Louise and Charles Edward Stuart, the Jacobite claimant to the English and Scottish thrones. Although King Louis XV of France recognized the succession of the House of Hanover, he also hoped that the legitimate Stuart line would not die out and would be an ongoing threat to the Hanoverians. The negotiations were delicate since Louise's family had no money of its own and relied totally on the goodwill of the Empress Maria Theresa. On the 28th of March 1772, Louise was married by proxy to Charles Edward at Paris. The couple met for the first time on the 14th of April 1772 when they renewed the marriage vows in person in the town of Macerata, Italy. Louise was henceforward recognized by Jacobites as Queen Louise of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland. Charles and Louise spent the first 2 years of the married life in Rome. In spite of the difference in their ages, the couple were at first happy together. But there were several shadows on the relationship. There was no sign of Louise conceiving a child. Charles had been encouraged in the belief that, if he married, the Pope would recognize him as King of England and Scotland, and France might provide funds for another Jacobite rising. Louise had virtually been promised that she would be treated as a queen. Instead, Charles found his hopes both of a son and of diplomatic recognition disappointed, while Louise found herself married to an old prince with no prospects, Count Vittorio Alfieri. In 1774, Charles and Louise moved to Florence. It was there that they began to use the title Count and Countess of Albany. In 1776, the Italian poet Count Vittorio Alfieri was presented at the palace. He became a frequent visitor. In Rome, Louise had had several young men pay court to her, but these relationships had probably not been adulterous. But sometime in 1778, Louise and Alfieri became lovers. Meanwhile, Louise's husband Charles had become a drunkard again, as he had been a number of years before. In December 1780, Louise left Charles and took refuge in a convent. She claimed, and it is widely believed to be true, that Charles had become physically abusive to her. Louise received the support of the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, the Pope, and her brother-in-law the Cardinal Duke of York, all of whom were unaware of Louise's ongoing adulterous relationship with Alfieri. Within a few weeks, Louise moved back to Rome. She lived briefly at the Ursuline convent before moving to her brother-in-law's official residence, the Palazzo della Cancelleria. Alfieri followed Louise to Rome, where for 2 years they carried on their affair in secret. In April 1783, the Cardinal Duke of York finally discovered the truth. In early May, Alfieri left Rome in order to avoid being expelled by force. In April 1784, Charles was induced by King Gustav III of Sweden to grant Louise a decree of separation. The couple did not divorce, but Louise was thereby permitted to live separately from her husband. In June 1784, Louise left Rome, purportedly to summer at the Baths of Baden. In August, she was reunited with Alfieri at Colmar. They spent the next 2 months together at the castle of Martinsburg. In order to continue to keep the meeting secret from the Cardinal Duke of York, they separated again, and Louise spent the winter of 1784-1785 in Bologna. She summered in Paris, before returning to Martinsburg, where she was joined again by Alfieri in September. After 2 months, Louise returned to Paris. In 1786, the Cardinal Duke of York learnt of the ongoing relationship between Louise and Alfieri. This caused a complete rupture between Louise and her brother-in-law. Henceforth she made no attempt to hide her relationship with Alfieri. From December 1786 onwards they lived together as a couple with only occasional and brief separations. On the last day of January 1788, Louise's husband Charles died. This resulted in a substantial improvement in her financial situation thanks to a previously agreed pension from the King of France. Although Louise now had the freedom to marry Alfieri, they did not regularize the relationship, since Alfieri had always opposed the institution of marriage. They lived at first in Paris. There Louise established a famous salon in her home to which the most important writers, artists, and intellectuals were invited. In 1791 Louise and Alfieri paid a 4-month visit to England. In 1792 the 10th of August insurrection encouraged them to flee from Paris. Only 2 days before the Republican authorities went to the home to arrest them, Louise and Alfieri settled in Florence. In 1793 Alfieri purchased Palazzo Gianfigliazzi, a mansion overlooking the river Arno. Here Louise re-established her famous salon, although perhaps on a somewhat smaller scale than in Paris. Louise continued to live with Alfieri until his death in 1803. Later life. After Alfieri's death, Louise's companion was the artist François-Xavier Fabre. It seems unlikely that the relationship was a romantic one. Louise continued to live in Florence until in 1809 she was summoned to Paris by Napoleon during France's war with Britain. He asked if she had either given birth to Charles Edward's child, hoping to find a legal heir who could then be used to cause insurrection in Britain. When she replied no, the meeting was abruptly terminated. A year later she was allowed to return to Florence. Louise is buried in the Basilica di Santa Croce in Florence. Alfieri is also buried in the Basilica. Ancestry, titles and styles. The 20th of September 1752 to 28 March 1772, Her Highness Princess Louise of Stolberg-Gedern. The 28th of March 1772 to 31 January 1788, Her Highness the Countess of Albany. The 31st of January 1788 to 29 January 1824, Her Highness the Dowager Countess of Albany, Jacobite. The 28th of March 1772 to 31 January 1788, Her Majesty the Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland, Jacobite. The 31st of January 1788 to 29 January 1824, Her Majesty the Queen Dowager of England, Scotland and Ireland. Bibliography. Douglas, Hugh. Bonnie Prince Charlie in Love. Sutton Publishing, 2003.